Imagine standing in a hospital parking lot in November rain, watching through a wall of glass as your stepmother and her daughter turn their backs on you, and understanding, with a clarity that no grief counselor ever gave you, that your father is dying 30 feet away, and no one will let you in. That was the moment I stopped believing that blood guaranteed safety. That was the moment I finally accepted what 29 years of trying had never been able to teach me. That some people will use your love against you the same way they use a key only to lock you out. My father remarried when I was 12, 8 months after my mother lost her fight with cancer. I don't think he meant for it to happen the way it did. I don't think he sat down one morning and decided to replace one daughter with another. But grief does something strange to people, and my father's particular version of grief turned him soft in all the wrong places, soft toward anyone who asked for very little, who smiled easily, who didn't remind him of what he'd lost. My stepmother Margaret was calm and uncomplicated in a way my mother never had the luxury of being. Her daughter Brooke was younger than me by 3 years and had learned early that the fastest way to a man's heart was to make him feel needed. I was his biological daughter who looked exactly like my mother. Every time he looked at me, I think he saw her. And after a while, I think that became the problem. I left for college at 18 and didn't look back as hard as I should have. I built a life, a real one, the kind you construct piece by piece out of stubbornness and student loans. I became a nurse. I married a man named David who thought my stubbornness was one of my most attractive qualities. We had 3 good years together before a driver ran a red light on a Tuesday morning and I became a widow at 27 while 4 months pregnant. I lost the baby 6 weeks after that. Grief, the doctor said carefully, can do many things to the body. I already knew that. I had watched it do things to my father for years. When I came back to my father's house that winter, I was not looking for rescue. I was looking for somewhere to land while I figured out how to stand back up. I brought one suitcase and the kind of exhaustion that doesn't respond to sleep. My father opened the door himself that first evening and held me for a long time without saying anything, which was the most honest thing he had done in years. For approximately 2 weeks, it felt like something real was beginning. Then, Margaret sat down across from me at the kitchen table one morning while my father was at his cardiology appointment, and she explained, pleasantly and without raising her voice, that she thought it would be best for everyone if I found my own place soon. My father's heart wasn't strong, she said. Stress was dangerous for him, and my presence, she searched carefully for the right word, complicated things. I asked her what things. She smiled and said she thought I already knew. I didn't leave. I probably should have. But my father was sick and I was his daughter, and somewhere underneath the 17 years of distance I still believed those two facts meant something. I started picking up shifts at a hospital 40 minutes away. I came home to find my bedroom door sometimes locked with a new lock I hadn't been consulted about. I found my name removed from the emergency contact list at my father's cardiologist's office, replaced with Brooks. When I asked my father about it, he looked uncomfortable in the way people look when they've already agreed to a version of events that doesn't include you. I understand now that it was systematic. I didn't understand it then because I was still inside it, and you cannot see the shape of a cage from the inside. Margaret and Brooke spent 8 months carefully and quietly building a narrative. I was unstable. I was manipulative. I was using my grief as a weapon to insert myself into a family that had moved on. They didn't say these things to my face. They said them to my father, gently and repeatedly, in the small hours of evenings when I was working night shifts, until the version of me inside his head became someone I didn't recognize. The morning my father's condition turned critical, I was driving back from a 12-hour shift when Margaret called me. She said the hospital. She said it's serious. She said you should probably come. By the time I arrived, Brooke was already standing at the entrance to the cardiac ICU unit, with her arms crossed, and a look on her face I had last seen when we were teenagers, and I had accidentally worn her sweater to school. She told me, with remarkable composure, that my father had asked not to have me in the room, that the stress of conflict was medically inadvisable, that she was sorry, but this was his wish and she had to respect it. I stood there in my scrubs, still smelling of a hospital shift, and asked her to let me speak to him directly. She said that wasn't possible. I asked to speak to his attending physician. She said the family had already been briefed. I asked what family, exactly, she meant. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite satisfaction and said, "The people who were here, the ones who showed up every day." I said I had been working to pay rent in the house they hadn't asked me to leave. She said, "I know this is hard." A security guard appeared at her shoulder. Not aggressively, just present, the hospital's way of making a suggestion. I walked back to the parking lot. The rain was steady and cold, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically but soaks through everything regardless. I stood next to my car, and I looked through the glass doors at Brooke and Margaret standing together in the lobby, watching me leave. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. And I thought about my father 30 feet away in a room I was not allowed to enter, and I thought about my mother 30 feet away in a hospital room 17 years ago, when I had been 12 and terrified, and someone had held my hand the whole time. The difference between those two moments felt like the distance between who I thought my family was and who they had always actually been. My father died 4 hours later. I was in my car in the parking lot. I didn't know he was gone until Margaret sent a text message that said simply, "He passed, peacefully. I'll be in touch about arrangements." I drove back to the house. My key still worked. I sat at the kitchen table in my wet clothes until Margaret came home and told me, with the same pleasant composure she had maintained throughout everything, that the house would need to be prepared for the estate process, and she wanted to handle it with as little disruption as possible, and she thought it would be cleanest if I removed my things within the next few days. I asked about the funeral. She said it was being handled privately. She said she would let me know the details when they were finalized. The details were never finalized in my direction. I found out the service had already happened from a cousin who saw it on social media 3 days later. I moved into a motel 12 miles away. I had enough in my bank account for 3 weeks, maybe 4 if I was careful. I had a suitcase, my nursing license, and the particular numbness of someone who has been grieving for so long that the new layer of grief just settles on top of the old one like snow on snow. I called the hospital where I'd been picking up shifts and asked about full-time availability. I applied for 2 apartments. I made a list of things I needed to do and I worked through the list because the list was the only thing I could control. On the 4th day, I received a certified letter. The return address was Callahan and Associates, Estate Law, Chicago, Illinois. I sat on the edge of the motel bed and opened it carefully, the way you open things when you've started to associate envelopes with bad news. The letter informed me that a Mr. Henry Weston, my paternal grandfather, had passed away 14 months prior, and that his estate had entered a verification and disbursement process. It informed me that as the sole biological grandchild of Henry Weston, I was the named primary beneficiary of the Weston Family Trust. It asked me to contact the office at my earliest convenience to begin the transfer process. I read it 3 times. Then I sat very still for a while. I had never met my grandfather. My father rarely spoke of him, only enough to convey that they had been estranged for most of my father's adult life, some falling out over the family business that predated my birth. I had understood vaguely that there had been money, at some point, in that branch of the family. I had never thought about it in any concrete way. It had nothing to do with my life. I called the number on the letterhead. A woman answered, professional and warm, and told me that Mr. Callahan had been trying to reach me for over a year. That letters had been sent to my father's address. That phone calls had been made. That there had been no response. She said this was not uncommon in cases involving estranged family branches, and that they were glad I had finally been in contact. She asked if I could come to the Chicago office. I drove 4 hours the next morning. Mr. Callahan was a quiet man in his 60s with the patient manner of someone accustomed to delivering information that rearranges people's understanding of their own lives. He walked me through the documents methodically. My grandfather had built Weston Industrial over 40 years, divested most of it in his final decade, and placed the proceeds into a structured trust. The trust had been growing through managed investments for the past 11 years. He told me the current valuation. I asked him to repeat it. He did. $1.9 billion. I put my hand flat on the conference table because the room had done something strange around me, a kind of shimmer at the edges, and I needed to feel something solid. I said that I didn't understand. He said that my grandfather had never stopped tracking his son's family, even from a distance, and that when he revised his estate documents 6 years ago he had been explicit. Everything was to go to his biological grandchildren, and to no one else. There was one grandchild, me. He said my grandfather had known my mother, had known what kind of woman she was, had written in his personal notes, which Mr. Callahan read to me quietly, that he hoped I had her character and that he was sorry he had never had the courage to introduce himself. I pressed my hand harder against the table and breathed. Mr. Callahan asked if I had any questions. I had approximately 400, but none of them would form into sentences. I asked, eventually, whether Margaret or Brooke had known this trust existed. He said the trust had been deliberately structured to bypass my father's estate entirely. It transferred directly to me regardless of what my father's will said. He said this was intentional. My grandfather had apparently understood something about the nature of certain families that I was only now catching up to. He said the letters sent to my father's address had never been forwarded to me. He said the phone calls had been answered by someone who said they would pass along the message, and then, as far as his office could determine, had not. He said this with careful neutrality, the way lawyers say things they want you to understand without taking a position. I thought about Margaret at the kitchen table telling me my presence complicated things. I thought about my name removed from the emergency contact list. I thought about standing in a parking lot in the rain while my father died without me. I thought about a certified letter from an estate attorney sitting in a pile of mail that someone had decided I didn't need to see. The anger that moved through me was not hot. It was cold and complete, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice because it has already decided what it's going to do. Mr. Callahan asked if I had somewhere to stay. I told him about the motel. He was quiet for a moment, and then he mentioned, gently, that the trust included several properties, one of which was a condominium in the city that had been sitting empty for 2 years. He said it was mine if I wanted to use it while we completed the transfer process. I stayed in Chicago. The next several weeks were dense and strange. Mr. Callahan's firm walked me through everything with a patience I hadn't expected and hadn't known I needed. There was a team of financial advisors, an estate manager, a legal coordinator named Patricia, who brought me coffee without being asked, and spoke to me like a person rather than a case file. The condominium was on the 14th floor with a view of the lake. I stood at the window the first morning and watched the water and tried to locate inside myself the person who had been sleeping in a motel with $400 and a list of apartments she couldn't quite afford. She was still there. She just had more room now. I called the hospital and withdrew my applications for full-time shifts. I didn't stop working. I picked up occasional shifts at a different hospital, smaller, closer. I needed the routine of it, the purposefulness. Nursing was not something I did for money. It was something I did because I had watched my mother die, and I had decided at 12 years old that I would spend my life making sure other people had someone in the room when it mattered. That hadn't changed. What changed was everything else. Margaret called 6 weeks after I left. She had apparently decided enough time had passed to reach out about, as she put it, some unresolved family matters. Her voice had the careful warmth of someone who has practiced the conversation in the mirror. She asked how I was holding up. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. She said my father had cared about me deeply, and she wanted to honor that by keeping things civil. I said nothing. I had learned, in the past 6 weeks, what it felt like to let silence do its own work. She said there was also a practical matter. The estate had been through probate. My father's visible assets had turned out to be somewhat, she paused, encumbered. There were debts she hadn't been aware of. The house had a second mortgage. Brooke had lost her job recently, and the timing was not ideal. She said she wasn't asking for anything, just that she wanted to be honest, family to family, because she hoped we could support each other through a difficult time. I said I appreciated her reaching out. She asked if we could meet. I said I would have my attorney contact her. There was a silence on her end that I recognized because I had spent years creating exactly that silence for other people. The silence of realizing the conversation has not gone the way you planned. The meeting was arranged through Mr. Callahan's office. Margaret and Brooke arrived expecting to meet a trust administrator. They did not know whose trust it was. Patricia had handled the scheduling and had been deliberately unspecific, which was, as she explained to me afterward with a mildness that I was coming to appreciate, simply accurate. They were meeting with representatives of the Weston Family Trust. That was true. I was in the conference room when they walked in. Brooke stopped first. I watched the information cross her face in sequence recognition, confusion, something that looked briefly like guilt before it hardened into the expression I knew better, the one that had watched me from a hospital lobby while I stood in the rain. Margaret went very still in the way of someone calculating quickly and not liking the results. I had spent a portion of the previous evening deciding who I wanted to be in this room. Not who I had been, the daughter standing in the parking lot, the girl who learned at 12 that grief could be used as a crowbar. I had decided to be someone I was still becoming, someone who didn't need them to understand what they had done in order to know what she was going to do next. I said, "Please sit down." They sat. I explained that I was the sole heir to the Weston Family Trust. I explained the valuation, calmly and without flourish, the same way Mr. Callahan had explained it to me. I watched Margaret's face as the number registered. I explained that I had become aware that correspondence from the estate attorney had been sent to my father's address over a period of 14 months and had not been passed along to me. I placed a folder on the table. It contained copies of the certified letters. It contained the phone records Mr. Callahan's office had compiled, calls made to a number registered to the household, 7 of them over 11 months. Brooke said, "We didn't know." Her voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. I didn't know what to call it. I called it true. Margaret said nothing for a long moment. Then she said my father had handled the mail. She said she hadn't known what those letters were. She said it very carefully. I said I wasn't there to argue about what anyone knew. I said I was there because I believed in honesty, and the honest thing was to be in the same room with them when I told them the truth, rather than letting them find out through a document or a third party. I said the trust was mine. The house was in probate and would be sold to settle the estate debts. I would not be contributing to that process. I wished them both well in finding a path forward, and I had asked Mr. Callahan to compile a list of resources, housing assistance, financial counseling, employment support that might be useful. Brooke said, "That's it?" I said that was it. She said, "We're your family." I let the word sit there between us. Family. I thought about 12 years old and a hospital room where someone held my hand. I thought about 29 years old and a parking lot where no one did. I thought about a letter sitting in a pile of mail for 14 months. I said I hoped they would be okay. I said I meant it. Then I stood, and I left the conference room, and I did not look back, because I had learned in the past 2 months that looking back was only useful if there was something behind you worth recovering. I was not leaving anything behind me. I was only moving forward. The months after that had their own rhythm. I kept working my shifts. I started therapy with a woman named Dr. Anand, who had a bookshelf that went from floor to ceiling and the quality of attention that made you feel like the most important person in the room without ever being theatrical about it. I told her about my mother. I told her about David. I told her about standing in the parking lot. I told her about the letter. She listened to all of it with the same expression, and then she said, "You've been grieving a very long time, and now you have room to do it properly." She was right. Grief, it turned out, needed space the same way a fire needed oxygen. I had been compressing mine for 17 years, and it had burned low and cold inside me without ever going out. In the condominium on the 14th floor, I gave it room. I cried for my mother in a way I hadn't been able to at 12. I cried for David. I cried for the baby I had lost. I cried, finally, for my father, not the father who had watched from behind glass while I stood in the rain, but the father who had held me for a long time in a doorway one winter evening without saying anything. Both of those men were real. I allowed myself to grieve the one and be honest about the other. I used a portion of the trust to set up the Weston Foundation for nursing education. I named it after my grandfather because I thought he would have liked knowing his name was attached to something that put more people in rooms where they were needed. The foundation offered scholarships and residency support for nursing students from low-income backgrounds. In the first year, we funded 43 students. I attended the orientation for each cohort and spoke for about 20 minutes and then stayed for 2 hours answering questions because I remembered being the person in the room who needed to know it was survivable. I was at one of those orientations, about 14 months after the conference room, when a young woman came up to me after the session and asked if she could say something. She was maybe 22, with the particular posture of someone who has learned to make herself small in rooms and is just beginning to unlearn it. She said she had read about the Foundation's founding story. There had been a piece in a nursing trade publication, something I hadn't entirely anticipated but had ultimately made peace with. She said she had grown up in a house where she was always the wrong daughter, where everything she did was held up against a sibling who could do nothing wrong. She said she had nearly withdrawn her nursing school application because she'd told herself she didn't deserve to take up a spot someone more capable could fill. She said reading that someone had felt that way and had kept going anyway had been the thing that made her complete the application. She said, "I just wanted you to know that your story mattered." I stood there in a conference room that was nothing like a hospital parking lot, and everything like one, and I felt something move through me that was not grief and not anger and not the cold clarity of someone who has decided what they're going to do next. It was something quieter than all of those things. It was the feeling of a door that has been locked for a very long time, finally opening from the inside. I told her that she had saved herself. I told her that I had only made the room. She nodded and looked like she almost believed me. And I thought, that's enough. That's exactly enough. I still work shifts. I drive 40 minutes to a hospital where no one knows about the trust unless I've chosen to tell them, which I rarely do, because the work is not about what I have. It is about what I am able to give when I walk into a room where someone is frightened and in pain, and the last thing they need is for the person holding their hand to be somewhere else in their head. My mother taught me that. She taught me without intending to, by being the kind of person who, even at the end, was always paying attention to whoever was in the room with her. I have a photograph of her on the windowsill in the condominium. She is 26 in the photograph, younger than I am now, and she is laughing at something off camera, and she looks like someone who does not yet know what is coming but who, you sense, will face it exactly as she faced everything else with her full attention and without flinching. I look at the photograph most mornings. I think about the kind of person she was trying to raise. I think I am getting closer. The greatest thing my family's cruelty gave me was not the moment of reversal. It was not the conference room or the certified letters or watching Brooke's face when she understood. Those things happened, and they mattered, and I am not going to pretend they didn't satisfy something deep and long ignored in me. But they were not the point. The point was everything that came after the foundation. The orientations, the young woman with the posture of someone learning to take up space, Dr. Anand's bookshelf, the lake outside my window in the early morning, the life I am building out of what I actually am, rather than what someone else decided I was allowed to be. My grandfather never met me. He tracked me from a distance and put everything he had built into a structure designed to reach me, and he died before he could see whether it did. I think about him sometimes, this stranger whose blood I carry, who apparently understood enough about the way certain families operate to build a wall around me before I even knew I needed one. I talk to his photograph sometimes, late in the evenings. I tell him about the foundation. I tell him about the students. I tell him I think I have his stubbornness, which seems like it might be the most useful thing he could have left me. If you are listening to this and you are standing in your own parking lot right now, your version of it, whatever shape it takes, I want something that no one told me when I needed to hear it most. The people who decide you are not worth keeping are not authorities on your worth. They are only people who made a calculation that had more to do with their own fear than with anything true about you. Their calculation was wrong. It was wrong about me. It is wrong about you. You are not what they decided to leave behind. You are what you choose to build next. And if you are not sure yet what that looks like, that is all right. Start with the list. Work through the list. The rest comes after.